If you find yourself feeling misunderstood, or if you imagine that people don't receive your message in the way it's intended, this video is going to help you understand how to translate yourself. In NLP, we call primary representational systems our most comfortable modality for giving and receiving information. Effectively, it's our natural communication style. So people deliver both verbal and non-verbal communication in different styles. These styles are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Auditory digital, which is the fourth modality, is rarely a natural style, and it is learned for use in the military, in business, or as a result of isolation in childhood. The purpose of understanding how we all communicate differently and how we can translate ourselves is to build connection, insight, and understanding. If we have a different communication style to the other person, misunderstandings can happen. And to overcome this, we identify our natural communication system and then practice delivering in our non-natural styles. This minimizes mind reading or assuming we know what the other person is thinking and feeling. Just be aware of the fact that sometimes we want solutions. Other times we have a conversation with somebody else just to be listened to and heard. Learn to know the difference. Also be aware of context. We may not want to communicate at home in our personal relationships in the same way that we communicate at work. In the middle of a confrontation, be as calm as possible and ask questions about the intention behind the words the person is using. We all associate specific words with specific intentions. However, this is not universal. So it's always useful to ask what the other person's intention is. If you don't feel that you are able to be calm in that moment, explain it. Walk away and revisit it when you are unlikely to lose your temper. In a romantic partnership, in the middle of a confrontation, if you feel that you've reached a point whereby you're not getting anywhere, often it's best to say, I love you, hug the other person, and say, let's talk about this again, let's make time. At work, if you reach a point of no return, it can be really useful to say, I think what you're doing here is great. Let's focus on that and book in some time to talk about any misinterpreted intentions here. Let's have a look at a little example of what I call communication ping pong. So let's say you're in the middle of a confrontation with your partner and they say, well, you left that dirty washing there just to annoy me. No, I didn't. The no, I didn't responds to the idea that your intention was to annoy. So because you say no, I didn't, the next response actually refers to the behavior of leaving the dirty washing. Then who left it there? The cat? Behavior. I did. Acknowledging the behavior. That's what I just said. Just to get at me. Intention. No, I didn't. Answering the intention question. You just said you did. Referring to the behavior. So we can see how these kind of confrontations go round and round and round. Everyone's referring to something different, and everyone is mind reading the intentions behind behavior. The first point that I want you to be fully aware of is intention. Always understand what the intention behind the words is. Next, let's look at challenges between visual and auditory systems. Visual dominant people tend to rely heavily on visual cues and facial expressions and written communication. So if you want to get your message across to a visual person, you're actually much better off writing an email, sending a text message. Whereas an auditory dominant individual prefers to be spoken with, and tone of voice is really, really important, and auditory cues are really important. If you want to talk about something important with an auditory person, resist the urge to have a conversation on text message because it will be a disaster. You want to actually have a conversation, preferably face to face, and if not over the phone or on Zoom. Tone is so important to auditory dominant individuals. They are so attuned to the nuances in tone of voice, and they may perceive visual dominant people as cold or uninterested if they don't use the expected vocal inflections. A visual person might say, "Look, you know I love you," and an auditory person will say, "Well, you don't sound as if you love me." This is really about being very aware of how people like to give and receive information. A visual dominant person might misinterpret the tone of an auditory dominant individual and completely miss subtle vocal cues altogether. In a working environment, visual people might overwhelm auditory dominant people with excessive visual information, such as slides or graphics, and auditory dominant individuals might struggle to process this information because they prefer to talk things out in order to better understand things. Then let's talk about impatience versus deliberation. Auditory dominant people may prefer in-depth spoken conversations that allow them to explore ideas verbally. Visual dominant individuals find this time-consuming and prefer concise written communication. This leads to impatience on one side, visual, and frustration on the other side, auditory. These two types also have very different learning styles. Visual learners thrive on visual aids, diagrams, charts. Auditory learners listen to lectures or discussions. In educational or workplace settings, these differences can lead to conflicts over presentation styles, teaching styles, and learning styles. Also be aware about attention and distraction. Visual dominant people are easily distracted by visual stimuli. If you are non-visual and you want to have an important conversation with a visual person, make sure there is no television on in the room. Sit them so that they are looking into the room rather than out of the window, because they will naturally get distracted by visual movement in their vision. And this can be perceived as inattentiveness, rudeness, or general lack of respect by auditory dominant individuals. And auditory dominant individuals might feel uncomfortable or distracted in visually cluttered environments. Now let's talk about non-verbal communication. Visual dominant individuals rely heavily on non-verbal cues like nodding, smiling, big hand gestures, while auditory dominant individuals may not pick up on those, or they could interpret them differently. Also, they may imagine that you haven't responded if you're visual because they couldn't hear a response. Also be aware that a conflict is resolved very differently between visual and auditory. When conflicts arise, visual dominant people prefer written communication to articulate their thoughts, while auditory dominant people prefer face-to-face discussions. This mismatch in conflict resolution style can obviously exacerbate misunderstandings. And finally, let's be aware of memory differences. Visual dominant people remember information better when it's presented visually. Auditory dominant individuals are like tape recorders. They can literally play back the conversation to you word for word. This leads to misunderstandings about what is discussed and what is agreed upon. So be aware. Next, let's look at challenges between kinesthetic and AD. Auditory digital individuals tend to rely on logic, fact, and process style communication. They prioritize data and evidence-based arguments. In contrast, individuals who communicate through feelings often emphasize emotions, empathy, and personal experiences. And this clash of cognitive styles can lead to misunderstandings and a complete failure to connect on an emotional level. Auditory digital communicators may also have extreme difficulty expressing their own emotions, and they might find it challenging to understand or respond to the emotional expressions or feelings of kinesthetic individuals. This leads to a situation where kinesthetic people feel unheard, or rather unfelt or unsupported. Let's talk about intention misinterpretation. Kinesthetic individuals often rely on emotional cues and nonverbal communication to gauge the intentions of others. Auditory digital communicators may not provide these cues, and this can lead to misunderstandings about their intentions or emotions. So, feeling orientated people might perceive them as cold and uncaring. Let's talk about complex idea communication. Auditory digital individuals might excel at conveying complex ideas and technical information, and yet they may have a huge challenge making their communication relatable and emotionally engaging. Whereas feelings-oriented individuals struggle to follow or connect with such communication that is complex and technical. They need to physically act it out or be shown or shadow the person to really appreciate it and understand it. Let's talk about conflicts. Auditory digital individuals might approach conflict very logically and analytically, focusing on problem solving and solutions. How could I fix this person or situation? Kinesthetics will find this profoundly challenging, and they prioritize emotional validation and empathy. This tends to leave with both parties walking away from conflicts feeling as if they are unresolved and that they may not be able to resolve them. Be aware. Let's talk about decision making. When making decisions, auditory digital individuals prioritize data and facts. Feelings-oriented individuals consider how decisions impact relationships and emotions. This can cause conflict. Now, the empathy gap. Auditory digital people have difficulty expressing empathy in a way that resonates with kinesthetic individuals. In the same way, kinesthetic individuals have a challenge to communicate their emotions effectively to somebody who processes information analytically because, guess what? Emotions don't make sense. Let's talk about feedback and criticism. Providing feedback and criticism can be really challenging. Auditory digital communicators may offer feedback in a factual and very blunt manner, and this can be perceived as cold and harsh by kinesthetic dominant people. On the other hand, feelings-oriented people struggle to provide constructive criticism in a way that has clarity, in a way that allows an auditory digital person to find the solution, see the solution, to be able to actually say, okay, so what are the steps that I need to follow in order to improve? How do we know who is what? Well, there are lots of ways to identify it. Firstly, and the easiest way, is body language and vocal tone. Visual people tend to speak very, very fast. They stand upright, they look very smart, and they speak in a very fast-paced voice, and it tends to be at the upper edge of their register. If you have people who walk in a room, a crowded room, and wave and shout at somebody on the other side of the room and go, hey, hi, how are you? This is generally an indicator that they are visual. Auditory people are very aware of volume and tone, and they tend to speak in a very melodic way. And if you are going to tell an auditory person that you appreciate their work, you would probably wish to do it in a very animated, melodic way. If you have an auditory partner, you would want to say, I really love you. And you want to ensure that within a confrontation, you are very aware of your tone when speaking with an auditory person. They breathe very much from the middle of their trunk, and you will see their trunk moving in and out. They are medium-paced in their speech, whereas a kinesthetic is very slow-paced. And a visual person can become quite irritated with a kinesthetic person as they breathe from what looks like almost close to their hips, below their navel. And they will speak low in their voice and slow. So slow, in fact, that other people may finish their exactly. Be aware, in terms of information chunk size, both visual and kinesthetic are really big picture. So often they will communicate in visual cues, feeling cues, facial expressions, and they will use minimal words. They like big picture concepts. If you are speaking with a visual or a kinesthetic person, limit the number of words you use. If you are speaking to an auditory or auditory digital person, they love details. They absolutely love to talk everything out. So they like to have a lot of detail. They like to have every single idea explained at length. They like to then tell you what they've learned, what they think, how they think we could do it better. And you will want to ensure that you give enough time to auditory people to speak out their story. Otherwise, they will imagine you have rejected them. Ask yourself so far, after watching this, what system do I think is my naturally dominant system? Where do I breathe? Do I speak in the upper end of my register or the middle, going up and down in a rather melodic way? Or do I tend to speak slowly at the lower end of my register? So ask yourself, the people in your life, are they dominant visual, dominant auditory, dominant kinesthetic, or are they much more logical? Are they auditory digital? Do they like steps and process? Just this small awareness will give you an insight in how you can tailor your communication to speak more effectively with those around you. I hope you found it interesting.